panels. The panel will be on the Turkish foreign policy in general, and we have some distinguished panelists with us, and a distinguished discussant, Duss, is with us right now. And just a short introduction of the panelists. With the name alphabetic order, Altay Atli is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science of Bogazici University in Turkey. He also works as the coordinator of the Asian Studies program in Bogazici University. The second panelist, Yevgeniya Gaber, is a PhD candidate in international relations and holds the position of assistant professor of Turkish studies at Odessa National University. And finally, we have Joshua Carney, a PhD candidate in communication and culture from Indiana University. And I will not take their time because we are a few minutes behind our schedule. And we will start with Altay Atli and continue with the alphabetic order. Each presenter have 15 minutes. And I would ask to be careful about the timing.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, it's my honor to be here at your presence to be talking about my favorite topic, economics and foreign policy. Well, economic considerations are increasingly in the foreground of Turkey's policy in recent years, and therefore there's a talk about Turkey's mercantile approach to foreign policy, and what we are witnessing is said to be the rise of a trading state. Economics has, in this sense, a dual function in Turkey's foreign policy calculations because it's, on the one hand, a means to an end because economic power abroad gives you kind of a soft power which helps you increasing your regional and global influence, but it's also an end in itself as well because with Turkey's economy growing, with Turkey's exports are growing, and with traditional markets like Europe in recession, you need market access. So cross-border economic presence is always set as a foreign policy asset. It has advantages, but can it also become a liability? This statement is from an interview I made with a senior bureaucrat in the Ministry of Economy who used to be the Turkish commercial counselor in Libya. What he says is, well, okay, it's an advantage, but it can also become a liability in volatile regions, in volatile times, because it can tie your hands and limit your ability to maneuver. So that's the question then. And talking about volatile regions and volatile times, I'm looking at crisis situations. This is the classical definition of a crisis situation from Charles Herman, like half a century ago. So high priority values of the organization are threatened in a crisis, time pressure, and the situation is unexpected and there's uncertainty. And the questions I'm asking are, so what is the role of economic interest? What is actually the role of economic interest in foreign policy during foreign policy crisis? And how do they impact the policies? And second, the agents of this economic interest, the business community and their institution representative business associations, how do they influence the process? And my case is I'm looking at the Arab Spring and Turkey's response. Well, in Egypt, as we all know, Turkey had in January 2011 when the upheavals broke out in the region, Turkey had a very immediate and direct response, a pro-democratic response, asking Mubarak to heed the desires of people and to step down. But in Libya, there was more of a cautionary approach. First, it started with the evacuation of Turkish citizens, which was completed in like 10 days successfully, 25,000 of them. Turkey started with efforts of mediation between the regime and opposition, and Erdogan talking to Gaddafi and his son. Eventually he asked him at least to choose a successor himself, which could be accepted by the opposition too. And Turkey directly opposed NATO intervention, asking for internal dynamics rather than external intervention to trigger change. But eventually it turned and Gaddafi was abandoned and Turkey recognized and began to support the opposition. And recent scholarly writing on this issue states that Egypt and Libya were different because there were Turkish people, Turkish citizens, a lot of them, and economic interests in Libya. So let's briefly look at this economic interest. If you look at trade, you see there's much more trade with Egypt than Libya. If you look at investment, okay, investment in Libya has been greater, but the difference, well, there has been also investment in Egypt and Tunisia. So it does not really explain the difference. And if you look at the number of Turkish citizens, there were 25,000 Turkish citizens in Libya. But again, when the uprisings broke out in Egypt, there were 6,000 Turks in Egypt too. Again, well, okay, it's a factor, but does not really explain. If you look at the construction business, we see the real story. Libya has been the one of the biggest markets for Turkish construction businesses since 1970s, early 1970s. And, well, after 2010, of course, it has disappeared because of the crisis and everything. But construction has been very big in Turkey. So this is why I want to make the argument that we should, when we talk about economic interest and foreign policy, we should refrain from taking the term economic interest or economic relations as a generic term. And we should, in a sense, open the black box of the what we call the economic interest. And because different kinds of economic interactions have different time horizons, they have different value added to your economy, and different foreign policy salience, foreign policy visibility, or foreign policy importance. Now, this table is, at this stage, it's the very early stage of my research, and it's based on my empirical observation as both a scholar and a practitioner, and the interviews I made with the people on the field. So a few examples, looking at the time horizon, the export, imports, they are of consumer goods, intermediate goods, low time horizon. Today you trade with them, tomorrow you trade with others or other goods. Resources like oil, gas, they have longer because they come with longer contracts. Services, again, like that. If you look at foreign direct investment, direct FDI is, of course, has a long time horizon because you go there and establish a factory or whatever. And in construction, likewise. When you look at the value added to the home country's economy, again, we have differences. Exporting or importing, $100 million of Chinese toys is not the same like $100 million of oil, or it's not the same like investing $100 million in a country where you generate employment and everything. Although the nominal monetary dollar terms value is the same. So they have different value added. And foreign policy salience, this is also related to the first two items. But the longer you stay in that country and establish your presence there, with your people going there, with your machinery going there, or the more there is competition with other actors, or the more dependent you are in whatever interaction there is, foreign policy salience can be expected to be higher. And when we talk about the construction services, you can see that it's in the foreground, because construction services, you establish a long-time presence in another country, you bring your machinery, you bring your people, everything there, and you stay there forever. And it's both capital and labor intensive. Turkish companies bring their own people, own workers and engineers to wherever they go, and also their own machinery. It's generating trade and investment. It generates trade because you import the construction materials and everything related to those services from Turkey because they are not available in Libya or Russia. And it's also generating investment. So officially, construction services make up 6% of Turkish GDP. But if this are also taken together with the trade and investment spillover effects, it makes up 30% of the Turkish GDP, which is very big. So very briefly, I'm not going to read all of them to you, but so this is where this table is coming from. My interviews with construction business owners, with people from the construction, Turkish Constructors Union, or with the Foreign Economic Relations Board. So you can see that construction business is different from export or other kind of external economic interaction, and it becomes an instrument of foreign policy. So keeping this in mind, I see the crisis situation faced in Northern Africa in 2011 as follows. This, on the left-hand side, you see Charles Horman's crisis definition items. Values are under threat. It's not about only material values, but also moral values, democratic values. Time pressure, failure to anticipate. In Egypt, well, democracy was at stake, security was at stake, but in Libya it was higher, because in Libya it almost immediately escalated to a very violent conflict. In material terms, as we have seen, okay, there was trade with Egypt, but in Libya, let me tell you, the figures. There were like more than 200 companies involved, $15 billion of projects in progress, jeopardized, 1.4 billion of uncollected receivables remaining in the country, $100 million of deposit in Libyan banks which were frozen, and 1.3 billion of physical damage. And your business was, in danger. I have spoken to many people from the construction industry, and Libya is very important. It's the, second largest market for Turkey. And they told me, if Libya is gone, if you will lose Libya, the business will suffer a lot. So that was a decision matrix, the expected utilities faced by the Turkish government in Libya. It started with the right upper corner, trying to mediate and opposing the NATO intervention. And if Gaddafi had stayed in power, that would be the best case situation for Turkey, because Turkey could, had mediated and could keep the construction business, and the competitors will be out. But as the events as the events progressed, it went down to the as they went down to the lower right-hand corner, with Gaddafi was apparently going. Turkey saw it was going to minus, and the decision was to shift to the left, to the plus sign, and support NATO asked to go, and at least you can have certain expected utility. And this is less than the best case situation, because in this case you will have new competitors like the French companies, British companies, Italian companies, Russian companies. If Gaddafi had stayed, Turks will be still number one. And but given the circumstances, this will be the best option. This is why I see the whole Libya process not as a failure of the Turkish government of adapting, of adequately responding to the situation, or having lost time or not knowing what to do, but a carefully calculated response to a crisis, and taking into consideration both moral and material values. Finally, I want to briefly look at business associations' involvement. I'm talking about here voluntary associations like TÜSİAD, MÜSİAD, TUSKON, DEİK, the Foreign Economic Relations Board, and at the theoretical level, in times of crisis, you can expect them to be excluded because it's a crisis, and the government would undertake it as a small group. But if economy-related issues are at stake, the government needs them, needs the representatives, the institutional representatives of the business community, because after all, when you talk about trade or investment, it's these guys who are doing the trade. It's not the government, it's the private sector. And they provide knowledge and experience the government needs to adequately respond to the events. They provide material and political support, legitimacy to the decisions, to government's decisions, which otherwise would appear to be purely political decisions, but with business support, they have greater legitimacy. And of course, there are mutual benefits involved. the business have their benefits, interests, protected, and the government gets the necessary input and feedback. So what we have seen in Libyan crisis, very briefly, I'm about to conclude, and several business organizations worked in coordination with each other and with the state, particularly the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Ministry of Economy. And they provided the state with updated information and specialized knowledge through the coordination meetings, which started right after the first events took place in Libya. And the state has not only helped them by saving the personnel and evacuating them, but also provided incentives, business relief measures like tax or other incentives. And business associations, as I said, legitimized the government's post-Gaddafi policies as well. When the government decided to support the opposition, the National Transition Council, and decided to provide $300 million, the business directly responded, saying that now they are in a better position because they will be also doing business with the Transition Council, and their interests will be protected. So again, I'm just going, I'm out of time. Again, what I said is evident here in the statements. And my conclusions are, and different kinds of cross-border economic interactions have different time horizons, different degrees of value added, and different levels of foreign policy salience. This is what we should take into consideration. And this is why in times of crisis, economic considerations can complicate the calculations depending on the nature of these economic interactions and become a liability. And when economic considerations are the defining parameters of the crisis, business actors are getting involved because they have to, the government needs them. And third, the final thing I want to say is it shouldn't sound like only economics, only material interests. Turkey is also supporting democracy, but not only for idealistic reasons or moral reasons, because it's also linked to economics. In Libya, for years, okay, Turkey did business, but Turkey has also suffered because payments were not made and everything. You can do business with authoritarian regimes, but you also suffer in that sense. And democracy is also good for business because you have a better business environment in that country. So we need to take that into consideration as well. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our second presenter is Joshua Carney.
Thanks very much, and thank you to SETA for having me here and inviting me to do a presentation that may be a bit different from some of the others. I'm coming from a humanities perspective as I go through this, but I'd like to start with an image because my presentation is about images, and this is it. It's a shop window that circulated in the Turkish press and television in December of 2004. And it was the shopkeeper's response to photos of the US attacks on Fallujah in November of that year. In a sense, it's a photo of the US image in Turkey at that time, but it's also a photo about the way photos circulate and contribute to the image of a nation, because it's a photo based on someone who got upset at a set of photos and then was later circulated in the press. So that's what I'll be speaking about today. First, the question when we speak about the image of a nation may be, what are we talking about when we speak about images? And I turn to W.J.T. Mitchell on this, who spoke about something he called a family of images. And these are things that, if you thought about them, they may come to you. But just to break them down briefly, we have graphic images, which are things like pictures, optical images, which are things we see with our eyes, so mirrors and projections, perceptual images, which include sensory data, mental images, things we would imagine, and verbal images. So, In this study, I start with the notion that the image of the US is closest to Mitchell's mental image, and I assume that other types of images, primarily but not exclusively graphical in Mitchell's terms, will contribute to this greater US image, though they are not the only things that form it. Next, it's important to recognize a certain intellectual landscape that is open up for theorizing about images. The fuller version of this paper delves into this topic, but for today I'm just going to highlight a few key concepts. The idea of a visual turn, the increasing prominence and importance of images in our heavily mediated lives. This has caused people to rethink the role of images that they may have in areas of life, but I'm going to focus on two relationships, that between images and politics, and that between images and trauma. So for the first, images and politics, this includes the notion that we're now in an age of what's called a public screen by some, rather than a Habermasian picture of a public sphere, and the accordant idea that political struggle has to happen through images, what De Luca called image fair in 1999. In addition to this, we have the idea that images can contribute to and enlarge political thought and democratic action. That's from Simon's 2000. And the notion of image critique, which is the idea that images themselves can be part of the act of theorizing and critiquing the world around us. The other topic I'd like to deal with today is images and trauma, and the basic idea here is that the meaning of trauma is changing in our mediated world, and Alan Meek's notion of historical trauma takes this shift into account, suggesting that trauma is itself a category of negotiated social meaning that builds community identity through the use of images. For my purposes in this argument, the key observation from Meek's historical trauma model is that images have a primary role in the way trauma is understood in a highly mediated environment. They are taken up and circulate in culture with reference to various identities, including the nation, and this circulation is not simply an innocent process whereby trauma is transmitted, but rather a process of identity formation worthy of investigation itself. It's just such an investigation that I've got in mind. What we'll be talking about today are 4 images, and probably just 2 of them, maybe we'll touch on 3, that have, to me, crystallized the US image in Turkey in the last, let's say, 12 years or so. The first is Clinton and baby Erkan Işık in 1999. The next was the Çoval Olay in 2003. The third was the photos from Abu Ghraib, which happened in Iraq but circulated widely in Turkey. And the final one came from this fall when Obama was on the phone with Prime Minister Erdogan and was holding a baseball bat. So why these images? The ethnographic data that supports them is mainly me talking to people throughout Turkey in my research on popular media and the image of the US, discussion with media workers throughout Turkey, and some textual research on the circulation of these images. So that's why I've picked what I have picked. So let's start with the first one, Clinton and baby Erkan Işık. The photo of Clinton and baby Erkan Işık was shot as Clinton visited the Doğu Kışla tent city of survivors of the Izmit earthquake on 16 November 1999, 3 months after the quake. The spontaneous image achieved immediate iconic status and circulated both in the Turkish press and abroad. Its effects in Turkey were particularly powerful as it turned Işık into a minor celebrity and created a prototype for politicians with children that is still in circulation to this day. Işık became known in Turkey as Erkan Bebek, and the media has kept up with his life. In 2009, there were reports of his 10-year birthday, another report on a reunion with Clinton that included a reenactment of the nose-pinching photo, and a report on his circumcision, among others. If Erkan's story continues to interest Turkey, the formal qualities of the image remain lodged in the Turkish psyche as well. Just in the last year, at least 2 stories in the press have reported on Turkish politicians having their noses pinched by babies, and both had likened the moment to the Clinton Işık image. The elements in this formal trope include a child and a male politician, that is, a figure of power. The gesture is one of familiarity that could be considered intrusive. In these circumstances, however, is not only sanctioned but made endearing due to the innocence of the child. It's in the original Clinton Işık image, the element of trauma is not visible, but it is nonetheless pervasive in the context of the image. Clinton was visiting a tent city after an earthquake that killed 17,000 people and left 500,000 homeless, and he was visiting the day 4 days after another earthquake in Düzce. The juxtaposition of this trauma and this photo made Clinton, who wielded great power on the international scene, become a human figure that Turks could relate to. For the purpose of the present analysis, the image's primary significance is to mark a starting point. When I lived in Ankara between 2004 and 2006, I was repeatedly told by Turks that the Clinton years marked one of the best times in the US-Turkish relationship. I saw the actual Clinton Işık photo long after I had heard about it many times. In fact, the topic for this paper relates directly to these discussions because it was only after hearing about the photo so often that I began to realize the synecdochic relationship it had with the more generalized US image. Though I have not recorded the conversations, they ran something like this. We used to love the US. When Clinton came and kissed that baby, he won our hearts. Now Bush has gone and destroyed all of that. The three elements of this exchange were consistent: good relations with the US, the Clinton Işık photo as an example of this, and Bush as a shift. A fourth element of these conversations was often present as well. As if to complete the synecdochic bridge between day and night, the Çuval Olay was called upon to represent the Bush administration's fundamentally flawed approach to Turkey. So, the Çuval Olay, or Hood event, refers to the detention of 11 Turkish Special Forces officers in Süleymaniye, Iraq on 4 July 2003. The soldiers, who had bags placed over their heads during the arrest, were taken to Baghdad and released 2 days later after intense diplomatic negotiations. The events that led up to the Çuval Olay are disputed. A photo purportedly of the event depicts 11 people in the back of a military truck. 9 of them had bags over their heads and hands tied behind their backs. The other 2 are uniformed soldiers with weapons. And I haven't been able to trace this photo. I have friends at Hürriyet and Radikal who've looked into it, and they say it comes from the AP, but they can't get a credit for. So I'm not sure if this is actually a photo from that event or one of the many reenactments. The image of the Çuval Olay, however, is far greater than this photo. It's a complex including, to use Mitchell's terms, at the very least verbal and mental images, in addition to the graphic. 2 sources that have given a sense of the immediate effects of the event are the Turkish press and the WikiLeaks cables from the US Embassy. Because I am more interested in the long-term circulation of the image, I simply put these up here and summarize them very briefly. The Turkish press was universally outraged and eventually began to ask some questions about why the soldiers were in North Iraq without uniforms and allegedly with explosives in the base. In the US Embassy, you see people being very concerned about what was going on, but unable to effect a change quickly enough to avoid a diplomatic crisis, which happened of sorts. I'm going to move to some of the later circulation of the image because that's what interests me most today. The photograph of the Çuval Olay that I described above continues to circulate as the most prominent image of the event, both in the occasional newspaper account that comes up with follow-ups and in the chat rooms and blogs of the internet. Given the importance of the strength and dignity of the soldier in Turkish society, the photo captures a moment that is very much in keeping with Kaja Silverman's definition of historical trauma, an event that manages to interrupt or even deconstitute what a society assumes to be its major master narratives. For Alan Meek, who builds on this definition, images themselves may provide an avenue for dealing with collective trauma. Rather than providing an authentic link with the past, images of violence and catastrophe often function as screensavers for group identity. They both memorialize suffering and deflect its emotional impact. Susan Sontag makes a related point in her discussion of the relationship between photographs and memory, saying the problem is not that people remember through photographs, but that they remember only the photographs. This remembering through photographs eclipses other forms of understanding and remembering. A 2010 post from a nationalist internet forum thread describing the raid is of interest in light of the above observations. It reads, and I have the Turkish up here, I'll read my translation. There was no resistance, they surrendered, they were made to lie on the ground, their hands were tied behind their backs and bags were put over their heads. I can't forget that day, I can't forget those photos. Turkish shoulders being in that state is hidden away like a ghoul in the most obscure corners of my memory. The depiction here reads like a certain kind of, a depiction of a certain kind of trauma. And the link between photos and memory here appears to be profound, in some sense supporting Sontag's claim about people remembering only the photographs. But there are extra details as well. The details of soldiers lying on the ground didn't come from the photo. And when you look more closely at the photo that is included with that post, it's this photo. It's a photo that's a still image from the 2006 movie Valley of the Wolves. So the person who wrote about this and said they couldn't forget the image posted right underneath that an image that is not the original image of the Çuvalıalay. And that's what interests me here, the circulation of images about an event that take on a kind of life of their own. So I'm going to try and get to the other images. I'm going to breeze past a few of the points that I'd like to say about the Çuvalıalay, which is the bulk of the paper, but very briefly, this isn't the only way this image circulates. There's a verbal set of images that have to do with soldiers drinking tea beforehand, and that also came out years after the original event and circulated both in the film and eventually a soldier, a general who wasn't there but was nearby, corroborated that account. So, I will say though that with regard to the Çuvalıalay, it's with us today as well. In October 20th of this past year, some Turkish youths from the TGB, the Türkiye Gençlik Birliği, took an American soldier in Bodrum and put a çuval head sack over his head and photographed the incident, and then held a press release afterwards. So it continues to circulate and have quite a strong power in the US today. In Turkey today, but with regard to the US image. So the Abu Ghraib images I'm going to skip. They're well discussed, and the main point I'd like to make there is that they actually may have contributed to a certain kind of, let's say, trend towards identifying with Islamic nations in Turkey that may not have happened otherwise. I mean, I think it would have happened otherwise, but I think they contributed to it. So we can talk about that later if we like. But the final image is Obama on the phone with Erdogan, and this happened on the 31st of July this year, and the very next day, people in the press corps were asking Obama about the meaning of it. After they asked him, the following day it became a major issue in Turkey. So critiques of the image have come in a number of forms. Those leveled at Obama for using it for an electioneering campaign, those leveled at Erdogan for being a pawn in Obama's power games, and those leveled at Obama for being the representative of a kind of US imperialism that dates back to Teddy Roosevelt, the notion of speaking softly and carrying a big stick having an obvious resonance there. And there's actually a Turkish proverb that goes along with that as well. Thus far, the photo hasn't particularly harmed US-Turkish relations. And I think one interesting thing about this is maybe as a result of Obama's image, which is somehow multivalent. He appeals to a lot of people in the US, and a lot of people have written about his image in the US and how he appealed to many bases. This is true in Turkey as well, with a lot of Turks actually believing that Obama might be Muslim. You can, if you ever watch the news programs, they'll often have people talking about him and saying, I think he might be Islamic. So that could be something to think about with that image. But I'm going to conclude by saying that the same group that dealt with the Çuvalıalay in October also held an image event where they were literally sticking it to Obama, holding up sticks, and suggesting that his stick was a threat to Turkey. So, yeah, let me leave it at that and suggest that such image events serve to remind us how important image really is, both for collective identity and for political action. And those are the two threads I've tried to follow up today. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last panelist is Yevgeniya Gaber.
Thank you, Kilic, and thank you, the whole SETA Foundation team, for bringing us together to this conference, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. So what I'm going to speak about today is the evolution of the Turkish-American relations in the recent years and its modern state. Turkish-American relations, with all their ups and downs, have always represented a roller coaster rather than a straight way forward. and they have never been insured of unexpected developments, as the recent event in the US Embassy in Ankara has showed once again. However, what I'm going to do today is not to go into details about some particular crisis in Turkish-American relations or in any periods of deterioration or reinvigoration of this partnership, but rather I will try to explain the change in nature and the change in logics of these relations. The name of my presentation is Reconsidering the Power Balance Equation in Turkish-American Relations in the Post-Cold War Era. And what I mean by this is the gradual evolution of the alliance from being explicitly American-centered alliance of the Cold War period and the early periods of unipolarity up to a more balanced partnership of equals in the recent decade. So for this purpose, it seems necessary to start with a short overview of the main factors that made possible Turkey's emergence as a powerful regional player with global ambitions or with global reach, to quote Ahmet Davutoğlu, Turkey's foreign minister. Then I will go on to analyze the implications of Turkey's emergence as a regional power for the United States, and I will conclude with some policy recommendations for the future. So while the 1990s witnessed Turkey's gradual emergence as a regional power trying to make use out of the geopolitical vacuum in the post-Soviet space, the 2000s marked a new stage in Turkey's foreign policy and in Turkey's transformation into a responsible international actor, ready and willing to play a much more responsible role, a much more active role in a broader neighborhood, using different mechanisms of influence, both formal and informal, and different instruments, both soft power and hard power ones. The results of these changes in Ankara's foreign policy was that in the post-Cold War security environment, Turkey's stand vis-à-vis the United States has changed to a considerable extent, namely from playing a role of a mere projection of American power in the Eastern Mediterranean to emerging as an independent foreign policy and security actor. However, rather than being ideologically driven, as it is often claimed, these transformations have much deeper roots, and they can be explained on several levels. Globally, they have been made possible by the gradual dispersal of power in the post-Cold War international system that has led to the emergence of a new international structure, which secured much more opportunities for the foreign policy activism of the new regional states, of the new regional powers. A lot of researchers agree that the first decade of the 21st century witnessed the United States' hegemonic decline and the emergence of the multipolar world, where almost all issues of global importance and even of regional importance, they still require the actions by the still single superpower, the United States, but also necessarily with some combination of other states which are predominant in different regions of the world. And Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense in 2001-2005, argued that there were a handful of keystone or pivotal states which were the main centers of this new emerging structure of the new world order, and he named that Turkey was high on that list of the pivotal states. What made Turkey's emergence as a regional power possible were definitely the domestic transformations in the background and the internal developments in the country. While after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Turkey had neither sufficient diplomatic resources nor enough economic power to act unilaterally and to position itself as a strategically autonomous security actor, it managed to show tremendous economic growth and mostly, in most cases, successful reforms throughout the 1990s and especially in the first decade of the 21st century. So while in 1990s, due to the economic crisis, internal political instability, and often government changes, and here I should mention that Turkey witnessed 10 governments and 9 foreign ministers in the period from November 1991 to November 2002, while this was absolutely impossible for Turkey to create any own initiatives, autonomous foreign policy initiatives in this situation, Ankara saw the only possibility to get technical, financial, and diplomatic support in promoting peace and stability in the region through establishing close dialogue with Washington, which was seen at that moment as the main and one of the most important partners and allies of Ankara. However, the Turkey of 2011 is quite different from the Turkey of 1991, or even different from the Turkey of 2001. A former CIA officer, Graham Fuller, given the general overview of the factors that made possible Turkey's emergence as a regional power in his book, The New Turkish Republic, Turkey as a Pivotal State in the Middle East, mentioned that apart from evident progress in consolidating military, economic, and diplomatic power in the Middle East, what places Turkey in an advantageous position while compared to the other regional countries is the democratic character and the legitimate government, which secured stable political situation in the country and made possible a certain desecuritization of domestic agenda. Today we heard a lot about this threats perception, which made this desecuritization absolutely impossible in the previous times. And this desecuritization of domestic agenda in its turn permitted a certain liberalization or a certain desecuritization of the foreign policy agenda, and as a consequent improvement of relations with the neighbors, with Turkey's neighbors. The so-called zero problem policy suggested in early 2000s was aimed mainly at the normalization of Turkey's relations with the other regional countries, but it also had far-reaching consequences for the general reconsideration of Ankara's foreign policy, or I would rather say the diversification of Ankara's foreign policy. The decreasing role of military elites, who were always regarded as the main advocates of strengthening Ankara's transatlantic and European ties, caused inevitable reorientation and diversification of Turkey's foreign policy agenda. In Jan Lesser's words, the first decade of the 21st century witnessed, quote, the most dramatic changes in Turkey's foreign policy priorities, symbolizing the real shift from security to commerce and from distant partners to immediate neighbors, unquote. A conventional view of Turkey's regional policy had been based on Ankara's traditional role as a force projection platform, filling an important niche in the United States' strategic position and being a mere bridge between the East and the West, connecting these two geopolitical areas but having no value in itself. The gradual expansion of Turkey's regional influence in the second half of the 1990s and reconsideration of its regional stance from policy implementer to policy producer and from security recipient to security provider in the region brought about a new understanding that Ankara should finally abandon this kind of niche diplomacy, just helping the United States or bandwagoning itself to the United States in the region, break away from the static and single parameter policy based on the exceptional cooperation with the Western partners, and instead develop a new comprehensive, multifaceted and integrated approach towards the region. So the result of all these transformations was that, like Turkey itself, the Turkish-American relations have undergone major transformations in the post-Cold War era. Aylin Güney, a Turkish expert on Turkish-American relations, singles out four main stages in the evolution of this alliance. He claims that while the relationship was referred to as an alliance during the Cold War, established with a common interest to contain the Soviet threat, the Soviet and the communist threat, the post-Cold War period posed important challenges and transformed the relations first into enhanced partnership, that is the second stage, and then into a strategic partnership, the third stage. While in the post-9/11 period, these relations, according to Aylin Güney, have entered another phase, and now they should be referred to as the Partnership for Democracy in the Middle East. And he also underlined the fact that the main factor in the background of these major changes in the nature of the alliance was a gradual transformation of Turkish foreign policy from being Western-oriented into a more independent and multidimensional one. So I thought it might be interesting to trace this evolution of so-called partnership-affiliated names throughout the last decades in the rhetoric of state officials and the language of bilateral agreements. In November 1999, Bill Clinton became the first United States president who characterized the Turkish-American relations actually as a strategic partnership, because in the previous times, it was mostly referred to as an alliance or very, very seldom as a partnership. This year, the 1999, was the year when at Helsinki summit, Turkey finally was given a long-expected chance to the European Union admission. For Ankara, it meant an official recognition of certain successes in the reformational processes inside the country. And for Washington, it meant the possibility to have a loyal partner with the 70 million population within the European Union decision-making mechanisms. Later, this term was also used in the name of a conceptual document, which was signed in 2006, Shared Vision and Structured Dialogue to Advance the Turkish-American Strategic Partnership. And the most recent term often used to describe this relationship, the so-called model partnership, which was introduced in May 2009 by Dr. Stephen Flanagan, director of the United States Turkish Strategic Initiative. While some Turkish experts evaluated this model partnership as a general move from American-centered partnership to the partnership of equals, according to Turkey's Foreign Minister Davutoglu, the term model partnership emphasizes the importance of high-level cooperation between Turkey and the United States and a positive partnership, active, not reactive partnership, unlike in the bipolar world. There have also been different terms used with this word partnership, like new partnership, for example, in the reports of the Independent Task Force of the Council of Foreign Affairs headed by Madeleine Albright, which stressed the yet underdeveloped economic and diplomatic dimensions of cooperation as opposed to the traditionally priority of the security and strategic arrangements that have dominated the bilateral relations so far, and so on. But while the formulations can significantly differ in the part of an adjective, like strategic partnership, advanced, enhanced, sustainable, enduring, model partnership, so on, what is important here is basically this transformation of the previously widely used term alliance to a new word, to a new term partnership, which implies more equal and at the same time more fundamental character of relations. So on the one hand, this points at a change in perception of a Turkey from being a secondary state aligning itself with a global leader to Turkey as an independent foreign policy and security actor. And as the former US ambassador to Turkey, Robert Pearson, said, this term partnership represented a broad recognition in both the executive and legislative branches of the United States of the increasing responsibilities of Turkey regionally and globally. At the same time, this change in terminology symbolizes that the nature and the raison d'etre of this alliance, previously called alliance, has changed considerably. And now it is a more fundamental kind of relations, and it is not only an alliance of different countries within a certain period, short or long period of times, just because they are united by some common threats or some common interests, but it's rather a partnership which can display itself as a cooperation on the matters of common concern, and thus is much more flexible in its forms. Thus, very often it displays itself on the ad hoc basis, on the situational basis, and in those situations when the interests, when the national interests of partners diverge, this does not necessarily mean that Turkey will align itself to the United States. So to conclude, what I should say is that there is obviously a combination of factors on global, regional, and local levels, as well as the dramatic changes in Turkey that have led to the present situation and that have changed considerably these relations of Turkey and the United States from being American-centered alliance to much more balanced partnership of equals. But we should regard it on several levels, because while there are some accusations of instability of this alliance, and even of there are some discussions about the end of the alliance, I don't think we should regard it like this. The point is that it would be quite difficult to create a single fixed framework, theoretical and conceptual framework for this new partnership between Turkey and the United States, between Washington and Ankara in the new international structure. However, it might be better to concentrate on those areas where the United States and Turkey join can join their efforts and can bring tangible results rather than to invent new hollow partnership models and trying to bring some single framework for these relations. At the same time, NATO can still become that vehicle through which the conceptual and the institutional framework of these relations can be secured. As John Ickenberg claimed, the United States power could be much more balanced and more legitimate if, rather than inventing new grand strategies, the United States reinvigorates its old strategy. The view that America's security partnerships are not simply instrumental tools, but critical components of an American-led world political order. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We had a good mix of 3 papers actually approaching Turkish foreign policy from different perspectives. Yevgeniya approaching from a hardcore IR perspective, whereas Altay is approaching from a more political economic perspective, and Joshua's perspective from humanities was provided actually a good mix of approaching foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy from and its multidimensionality from different perspectives. And now we have can we call our own Matt Duss, who works with joins our events a lot. Matt Duss is a policy analyst and the director of Middle East Progress at the Center for American Progress. And we will hear his question to the presenters, and then we will open the floor for the questions.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, thanks so much for the privilege of being here with SETA. I always enjoy doing work with this organization, and to the writers, congratulations on very interesting papers. I enjoyed reading each of them and learned quite a bit from each of them. As you said, they each dealt with some different aspect of Turkish foreign policy, but I did find it very interesting that each of them in some way dealt in some aspect with the domestic determinants of foreign policy, which should not be a surprise. I mean, the domestic public opinion is one of the things with such parameters in a democracy for that policy. So first to Altay, I found the comparison of Libya to Egypt very interesting, as my friends got tired of me saying during the first year of the Arab Awakening. The Arab Awakening revealed everyone's hypocrisy. The United States, Iran's, Turkey's, with regard to, maybe hypocrisy is not the right word, but the contradictions and tensions. And I think it took a long time. It's taken America quite some time to understand there are certain tensions that cannot be resolved. The question is how best do you manage those tensions? I think it made a very, very good contribution in terms of delving a bit deeper into what do we mean when we talk about economic interests. Economic interests are not all created equal. Some of them create different constraints and create other opportunities on foreign policy. I would have liked to see a bit more on what you talked about the ways in which the Turkish government and Turkish policymakers did and did not engage with business leaders, and I think I would have liked to see a bit more in terms of specifics and what those communications looked like, how they did engage, how different business organizations reached out to the government and whether their recommendations were taken on board. And in terms of policy recommendations, perhaps discussing what possibilities or opportunities there are to create a formal mechanism. Of course, business organizations have ongoing engagement and discussions with government and policymakers, but what opportunities exist for creating a more formal mechanism to deal with crises like these as they come up. Secondly, to Josh, a very good examination, I think, of the particular historical context for each of those images. Again, I learned quite a bit, having not been really focusing on Turkish policy so much in the 1990s, unsurprisingly. No, that the discussion of Bill Clinton, it's good to know that Bill Clinton's political acumen carried over into the international context there too. In looking at things in a way this might be relevant for a U.S. political audience, I was kind of curious about what might some comparisons be to similar images like that. And the one that immediately came to my mind was the image from the Oklahoma City bombing of the firefighter holding the baby. What this says about that event, what it says about our conception of ourselves, and that's where I think I can move into one of the things that really stood out to me, or that I wanted to hear more about. Your discussion of images, and this is in the way that Turks regard these images and the way these images are looked at in the Turkish media and what the image they create of the United States. As you know, to go back to Saeed's work, you know, when we create these images of another country or of another people, not only are we telling ourselves something about them, but what we tell ourselves about them is something we are telling ourselves about ourselves. So I think what kind of ideas are Turks trying to reinforce about themselves and the way that they regard some of these images. And finally to Yevgeniya, again, congratulations on this paper. It was a very useful, I think, examination of the language that has been used over the past several decades to discuss the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I think that could have, I mean, that's a very good idea, and I think it might benefit for a bit more specificity, even build that section out. I think the 3 sections that you found, I think were very, very good, but I think a bit more hard, you know, references, citations to a specific use of this language. And again, going back to my earliest point, in the way that, you know, the way that policymakers and political leaders talk about the relationship in these public events, I think goes very much to the you know, helping to create the parameters with regard to public opinion. And in your second to last graph here, I think you addressed this question specifically, and I think that was very good. So again, I would just encourage you to kind of build that out a little more, to take a harder look on what domestic, you know, public opinion, how engaging with and trying to manage public views of the United States and vice versa kind of creates parameters for what is and is not possible in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. And in terms of recommendations, I think it's always, you know, it's always a touchy business when you talk about government, you know, specifically trying to manage perceptions, but I think we have to recognize that's what governments do, and we often refer to as public diplomacy. I think the harder term is propaganda, but I don't think we have to quite go that far. But I think we can recommend certain things, ways in which governments can engage with civil society organizations to help shape and encourage you know, certain views of the United States and the United States to Turkey. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. And I want to give a couple minutes for the presenters, their response for the recommendations, or if they want to contribute or add anything to the other presenters' ideas. You have 3 minutes each. Altay, we can start with you.
My question was about the state business engagement and the mechanisms, the formal mechanisms. So I can answer this question in 2 parts, because first we have the formal mechanisms which are, you know, in place all the time, not during the crisis only. These are some institutional arrangements. And then we have the, you know, the crisis measures. Starting with the former, there are a number of formal institutional arrangements through which state and business communicate and participate together in the formulation and implementation of foreign policy. For example, I can start with the most formal of them, the so-called joint economic commission meetings at the intergovernmental level. These are between the 2 governments, like Turkish, Russian, Turkish, Chinese, whatever. And these are between the governments, but the business community has always a seat on the Turkish side. And this seat is taken by a specific business association, the Foreign Economic Relations Board, and actually I worked for them, so I was taking part in these meetings. And this is the way the business community can bring its opinion and positions and preferences and concerns to the table at the governmental level. Then, on the business association side, they organize this big bilateral business summits. They have different names for different organizations, but the idea is the same. For example, when a foreign leader is coming to Turkey, the business community, different organizations, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes separately, organize this. They bring together the 2 sides, business communities, and these are attended by the Turkish government at the highest level, usually the level of the prime minister or the president. And these meetings have a kind of a quasi public nature, because okay, they are organized by the business, the business bring its interest and opinions there. The government, recognizes this and appears there. But at the same time, during these meetings, also governmental agreements are signed. Recently, I have taken part in a Turkish-Indonesian meeting with the attendance of Prime Minister Erdogan and Indonesian President Yudhoyono. There were 8 agreements of economic nature between the Republic of Turkey and Republic of Indonesia signed. And finally, these associations have membership bases. They represent the business. And the membership base is a communication with the management. And there's a direct communication. The businesses, individual businesses, communicate their own interest, opinions to the management. And these are forwarded to the government at a regular and institutionalized manner. And of course, there have been emergency measures as well. We have seen this in Libya. The first thing they did was right after the next day when the events broke out in Libya, they opened up Libya desk at the Ministry of Economy with the participation of business associations. And regular meetings were held, this so-called coordination meetings. They held this like every 10 days or 15 days. Where the business people came together with the Minister of Economy, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the other guys from the public institutions, and providing them with information about the field in Libya and bringing their suggestions there. And finally, I just want to read a very brief statement which I couldn't read because of the time limitation. This is from someone from the Ministry of Economy who was, one of the people in charge during the Libya crisis. He says that the Constructors Association has played a key role and provided substantial assistance for us in our problems with Libya, such as problems with receivables, progress payments, damages and losses, by compiling the problems experienced by individual firms and helping us to formulate a main policy. It was us who were, as official negotiators, going to Libya and discussing these issues with Libyans, but we have prepared the basis of these negotiations, both technically and strategically, with the Constructors Union. It was the same with the Foreign Economic Relations Board. They have been a major component of our efforts for formulating a quantity strategy. And of course, these business associations have their long-established presence in Libya with their connections, with their relationship with the Libyan private sector and the government. 2 lines from the Deputy Secretary General of the Constructors Association. We have seen this in Libya and we have seen it before. The state cannot solve the problems on its own. Companies are in a difficult position, but companies can also deal with the problems themselves. They have their own relationships there. Companies want to become a member of us. This is very important because the association has power, lobbying power, vis-a-vis both the Turkish state and foreign states and governments. So this shows how this mechanism goes from state through business associations and the country in question and working in foreign policy formulation. Thank you. Comments?
Thank you. Josh?
Thanks, and thanks for your question, Matt. I think the draft of the paper that I was working on last night may have started to answer that a bit, but I'll work on it even more in line with that. I think one of the things that may help answer that is the notion of historical trauma that Meek uses. And it's one that isn't necessarily thinking of trauma as something that exists on its own, but something that happens in a social context, and particularly with relation to images and the way they circulate in media. So the story that people are telling themselves about themselves through images is created in this process of negotiation over time. And we can see that happening in the images that I dealt with, I think most obviously with the Çuvalı lie, which goes through a number of iterations. In terms of what people are saying about themselves, there are a few things that they might be saying. We are a nation, and we suffered together. When we speak about trauma, we suffered together in some way. Whether it's suffering from the images, seeing them, as one person on the discussion group described, or suffering war or something like that, depends. But these things are negotiated and they create identity in that way. The other thing they often say is that we're not the kind of people who do that. And when we look at the Çuvalı lie or the Abu Ghraib photos, I think they circulated in Turkey much in that way. We're not the kind of people who would do something like that. So with Abu Ghraib, I didn't get a chance to speak about that very much, but the reason I think those photos tended to contribute to some sort of level of Islamicization in Turkish culture is that people from across the board had to stand back and say, look, this longtime ally, or semi-longtime ally, well, 60 years, does this, and we can't possibly be on board for that. I mean, the first photo I showed of the shop window was from a guy who is a Levi, and he would normally not align himself with with political parties in Turkey, certainly neither with the AK Party or the CHP. I spoke to him, but he had to say, well, we're all brothers, and I feel very deeply for the people in Iraq, in Fallujah, after Fallujah. So there's that kind of thing. We're not the kind of people who do that. And this goes to the extent that the Doğan Group, a very secular media group, invested heavily in Kurtlar Vadisi Iraq, the film, a film that really portrays Islam in a positive light and portrays Christian zealots on the American side. And there were some precedents to that in the U.S. administration, actually. So it's an interesting portrayal that isn't as far off, maybe, as some people have claimed. With regard to the Çuvalalay, the tea story kind of gets at that as well, because I didn't get a chance to speak about it, but the repeated trope was these were people they had had tea with just hours or days before. How could you do that to someone you just drank tea with? And for Turks, I mean, I'm saying Turks writ large, but all of the Turks I spoke with who brought this up, and maybe I'm throwing this number out there, but probably 80% of the people who I spoke to about the Çuvalalay spoke about this tea story. This was a real point of difference in the kind of way you would treat someone and the way you would deal with hospitality, and then going and turning around and doing something like that. I don't know whether the tea story actually happened or not. In fact, quite a bit about the event suggests to me that it may not have happened, but it circulates that way and it has that kind of image in effect.
Yevgeniya.
First of all, thank you for your comments and for your compliments. As for the suggestions to make a more detailed examination, this paper is a part of a more comprehensive work. So there I try to trace not only the change of these rhetorics of the state leaders, but also, for example, to look at the language of Turkish newspapers and of Turkish journals. Especially, I made a kind of research on the language of the Turkish media after the Iraq War 2003, and after that Çuval Olayı or Hood incident. And it's interesting how quickly these rhetorics can change from naming or labeling the United States the ally, the closest partner, strategic partner, up to the biggest threat for Turkish security. And it's interesting also to look at the polls, at the opinion polls which were made in Turkey in 2000s, in the middle of 2000s, when Turkey was the only country in the whole world where the United States had the worst image ever. Not Iran, not even Syria, not any other states, but Turkey, which was actually very much surprising. And the other point which I should make here is that in Turkish-American relations, to my mind, the top-down approach has always dominated these relations. That is to say, not dependent on what people think of each other, not dependent on any cultural or social ties between Turkish and American communities. There was also a kind of agreement between the elites, the foreign policy making, security policy making elites in Washington and Ankara, and this was this point that the partnership should be maintained was out of any discussions. And on the one hand, this somehow facilitated the strategic partnership during the 1990s and during the Cold War. But now in this new environment and in this new situation within Turkey, when the public opinion has been gaining more and more importance in the foreign policy making, and at the present time the government cannot take any decisions without looking at what people say, I think that the situation can change, and the editor of Inside Turkey, İhsan Dağı, wrote once, I like that sentence very much, that to win over a country and to secure good relations with the country, the government should not only win over some strategic priorities, but also over the hearts of the Turkish people. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to promote any strategic agendas on the background of the strong anti-American sentiments in the streets. And even after the 2007, for example, when the relations were trying somehow to be mended after the meeting of Erdogan with Obama, the thoughts, the opinions of those Turks to whom I had a chance to talk was almost the same as after the 2003, because this public opinion takes much more time to be changed than just to come to a summit or to sign a new strategic partnership agreement between the leaders. That's why this Kurtlar Vadisi Iraq, for example, was a very famous film, and the other film in this series also, after the deterioration of Turkish-Israeli relations, show how important it is not only to take some decisions and try to implement them in the societies, but also to secure different dimensions of these relations, really to fill this partnership with the real content, with economic ties, with cultural ties, and basically all these new model partnerships or new partnerships, they dwell upon the idea that given this desecuritization of foreign policy agenda in Turkey, if nothing is made, no developments happen in the economic relations, in the cultural relations, social relations with the United States, it might be difficult to find any driving forces to bring them to a new point and to a new level. So it seems necessary really not to stay with the strategic agenda, but to broaden it and to make it really multidimensional. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yevgeniya. And now I can open the floor for the question. If you have any question for the participants for this panel, please approach to the mic and briefly identify yourself and state your question. Yeah.
Kanat, SETA Foundation. I have a question for Josh. I worked on this to some extent, so this just attracted my curiosity. The way I see it, at popular level, the cultural representations of the United States in Turkey have sort of three periods. In the 1990s, America is this like ideal land where we want to reach in terms of like democracy, freedoms. Interestingly enough, a lot of sexual freedoms as well. It's a conservative society. You sort of reflect on that through the mirror of the US. A lot of pop music videos, for instance. In 2000s, I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of, there's a sense of hostility and betrayal from the United States. And most recently, I feel there is some closure. An example that you didn't bring up was the story of two Ottoman military officers going to America. The Yahşi Batı, the, I guess, Ottoman and the Wild West. A comedy film, but I think it's all in the details. In one of the scenes, entirely disappointed with America, the guy has been, they've been robbed by Native Americans, et cetera, and they're sitting in their underwear in front of a post office. And one of the characters goes, America, you were but a dream. So, against the background of that, where do you think we stand now? I mean, given Turkey's emerging status as a regional power, sort of more self-confidence, where do we stand in our relations with the US culturally?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the question. And I will have to check that film out. I haven't seen it yet, so okay. It should be on my agenda. I think the final image with Obama, which I didn't get to speak too much about, is useful in this. I mean, you can read quite a bit into that image, and plenty of columnists in Turkey have done just that, attacking it from all kinds of points of view. But one thing that I find interesting is, to me, my impression of the Obama administration is that they handle their images very carefully. And I would not take this image as accidental myself. I'm tempted to think there must have been some meaning there. But that meaning conveys a number of things, and on a few levels, it's something like this. It's first off an image of friendship. There's a kind of friendship and a close connection on the phone. Second off, we have this baseball bat, which if you think about the American phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick, means something. I mean, the Obama administration said it was because Obama's a huge baseball fan, and I think it was a Hank Aaron bat, maybe. I don't remember for certain. But at a third level, we see that the image means in the implicit threat, if there is an implicit threat there, a kind of respect. I mean, if you think from the Clinton image where this American president is there offering money, offering tents, and kissing a baby, to the point where Obama has to be threatening Erdogan on the phone, it's a kind of a recognition, not threatening him on the phone, but through the image in this kind of this multivalent threat. It's an implicit recognition of a great deal of power that the U.S. is now dealing with Turkey on a different level, an entirely different level. And I think that's something that you can read there, and I think it's there. So that may be where I come with that.
Okay, thank you. Armen Sagan, a research associate from the European Institute. My question is for the panel, but I'd particularly like to hear Yevgeniya's opinion on this, because you identified the 4 stages of the changes of terminology. My question is in regards of this vis-a-vis the political vacuum that was created in the region in the neighborhood of Turkey after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So how would you assess, has Turkey really lived up to the change of terminology in action towards its neighboring states in the South Caucasus, namely Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia? And what do you think should be done more or should be done less? What's your assessment of the situation? Thank you.
One of the most important points that should be made while analyzing Turkey's relations with any other country, namely with the United States, is the regional level of its relations, because it's not a secret for anyone that the Turkish-American relations are basically not only the relations between the two countries, between Ankara and Washington, as it often happens in some other partnerships, but it is very much depends on the attitude of Washington and Ankara towards the third parties, and whether these foreign policy visions are incompatible or whether they overlap creates the framework for the development of the bilateral relations. And this factor has been underlined in the works of a lot of experts. Very often you can read about some kind of strategic glue which is needed in these relations, that is kind of influence of the third parties in order to bring Washington and Ankara together or to provoke any crisis in these relations. And of course, all these regional developments have brought both a lot of new challenges and a lot of new opportunities for the United States and Turkey. If we speak about the Middle East and the Arab Spring, as far as the new opportunities are considered, this is Turkey's emergence as the model for these new countries, and this is the first time when the model, the role model of Turkey was proposed actually by Ankara itself. Because, for example, in 1990s, we also witnessed the situation when a lot of different discussions were made about Ankara's role as a model for these countries, but still it was proposed by Washington, by the European Union, who tried to make or somehow to call the other countries to follow the Ankara's secular path and not to go onto the way of Iran, for example. But then Ankara itself was not ready to undertake this role. What changed in the new regional environment is that the first voices of we can show the reforms, we have the experience of democratic reforms came from Ankara itself, and then later they were supported by Washington. So definitely the regional dimension is very important. And if we speak about the Caucasus, for example, well, a lot of attempts were made for the rapprochement with Armenia and for improvement of relations with all regional countries. They are not always successful, but what has changed is the desire of Ankara to develop relations with the neighboring countries. and the desire of Ankara to develop them, not depending on the view of the other global actors like the United States, for example. And if I may, I just wanted to quote, to make a very short quote of Davutoglu about the changing nature of Turkish-American relations in this sense. He said that the main characteristic of Turkey's new foreign policy is its self-reliance and strategic autonomy. We suffered from a perception that other powers design regional politics and we only perform the roles that assigned to us by the others. We need to do away with the psychological sense of inferiority which was permitted in many segments of our society and amongst political elites. Today we determine our vision, set our objectives and execute our foreign policy in line with our national priorities. We might succeed or fail in our initiatives, but the crucial point is that we implement our own policies. We do not receive instructions from any other powers. Our policies toward neighbors are devised with careful consideration of our own evaluation of the situation. As has been the case so far, we will continue to coordinate our policies with those of our Western partners as we see fit it, but we will never let such partnership negatively affect our relations with neighbors. So, given such a quotation by Ahmet Davutoglu, the current foreign minister, I should say that as far as the interests of the United States and Turkey overlap or coincide, they will promote new forms of partnerships, and this can be partnership for democracy in the Greater Middle East project when this was on the agenda, or this can be a model partnership within the situation of the post-Arab Spring Middle East. But if the national interests and if the strategic agendas of both allies will differ, then I think we will witness just new crisis in these relations. Thank you.
One more question we have.
My name is Ege Cansu Saçıkara. I am a master's student from Syracuse University, and my question is to Altay Atli. I was wondering if you could tell us your perspective on the current and future financial challenges to Turkish businesses in the Arab awakening countries, and how the Turkish foreign policy should be built around these issues. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, but before answering this question, maybe I can say a few words related well, okay, actually I will take the opportunity of your question to add something to my own argument. And I will, about the regional dimension of Turkey's policy, particularly with respect to Caucasus. And in year 2009, when this Turkish-Armenian rapprochement was in progress, I was in Kars. For those who don't know, it's the neighboring province to Armenia. And I could speak to local people, and particularly the taxi drivers who were very interested in what was going on. And they said, if you today have a referendum in Kars, if we should open the border or not, they said it will be 99% yes, let's open it. Because, I'm coming to my own argument. I was talking about, not taking economic interest as a generic term and opening up the black box of the term. The border trading is very important. Trade with Armenia is maybe not so important for Turkish economy, but for this region, it's very important. And now we see how this people in provinces bordering Syria are suffering. So this is another aspect. This is another way of differentiating between different kinds of economic interests, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond to that. And with regard to Turkish business interest and business and financial interest in the Arab region in the future, I will say that that Turkey is now with this region. Turkey has always had a trade surplus and is exporting to this region, but Turkey is now diversifying its economic relations with the region. Of course, the region has its problems. We have seen in the graphs that with Syria, it's like gone down to nothing. But with Egypt, there's a rapid increase now, and Turkish business associations in the post, Arab awakening or spring period have been very active. For example, I know about Egypt. There have been a number of business, delegations going to Egypt, and thanks to their efforts, now trade with Egypt is actually higher than and increasing faster than before the crisis. So actually, in the post-crisis, uprisings period in the Arab region, there's much more potential to establish economic relations, but as I said, there are different kinds of them, and the important thing is important in the sense of establishing mutual benefits with the other side, so that it turns into a foreign policy advantage for both of them. It's important to focus on longer-term, interactions, and here I think construction businesses and foreign direct investment has a large space in the future in this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists, and thank you for your participation. And we will give a short break, 15-minute break, coffee break now. And after that, we'll be back here together for the last panel. And please join me to thank for both presenters and the discussion.